You think you know what a person does for a living, until you watch them realize it themselves. The morning of October 7th, Marcus Webb did not want to get out of bed. This was not unusual. Marcus had not wanted to get out of bed on most mornings for the better part of 2 years, not since the plant closed and the severance ran out, and the version of himself he had built across 22 years of steady work quietly ceased to exist. He got up anyway, because there were 3 people in the house depending on him to perform normalcy. And performing normalcy was the one skill he had transferred intact from his former life. He made coffee. He woke his kids. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard and thought about nothing in particular, which was how he had learned to keep the particular thoughts from arriving. His wife, Paulette, came in at 6:40 and put her hand between his shoulder blades without saying anything. She had been doing this for 22 months. She still did it every morning. Marcus had never told her what it meant to him because there wasn't language that fit. It was too simple and too enormous at the same time. The hand, the silence, the daily insistence of it. He was 51 years old. He had worked at the same manufacturing plant in Youngstown, Ohio, for his entire adult life. He started at 23 as a floor technician, worked his way to shift supervisor, learned every machine by its sound, knew which ones ran cold on rainy days and which ones you babied through the first hour, and which ones you never turned your back on. He had trained 61 workers over 22 years. He knew this because he had counted. He had been counting things since the plant closed, things he had not thought to count before. Years, people, mornings, the particular way a life accumulates into something solid and then doesn't. The closure was announced on a Wednesday in December. By February, the building had a padlock on it. Marcus had stood in the parking lot on the last day and watched the lights go off section by section, the way a city looks from a plane as it descends, and the grid begins to resolve into individual houses. And then he had driven home, and he had not gone back. The family Feud application was their youngest daughter's doing. Her name was Briella. She was 16, and she was the kind of teenager who moves through the world with a certainty that hasn't yet been introduced to its limits. And she had filled out the form on a Sunday afternoon and announced at dinner that she had done it. Marcus had looked at Paulette. Paulette had looked at Briella. Briella had looked at both of them with the expression of someone who has already decided the outcome of a negotiation. Marcus had said, "All right." He had not meant, "all right." He had meant, "I don't have the energy to argue with someone who is absolutely certain. So, all right." They were selected 8 weeks later. Marcus told the pre-interview producer that they were a close family who liked to argue. He said this was simultaneously true and not a contradiction. The producers said that was the most family Feud sentence anyone had ever said to her, and that they were going to be great. The family he brought to the stage that October afternoon was Paulette, Briella, their oldest daughter Camille, 24, who had driven from Columbus, and Marcus's brother Dion, 47, who had been unemployed since the same plant closure and who had the same shadows under his eyes and the same particular set to his jaw, the look of a man practicing patience with circumstances he did not choose. They walked out to warm applause, and Steve Harvey looked them over with the quick, accurate attention he brings to every family, reading not what they present, but what sits underneath the presentation. He started easy. He asked about the family, the hometown, the dynamic. Paulette was funny and fast, and the audience responded to her immediately. Camille was precise and a little competitive, and made Steve Harvey laugh twice in 90 seconds. Briella was Briella, absolute, radiant, convinced. And Steve Harvey watched her with the particular delight of a man who recognizes a force of nature. Then he looked at Marcus. He asked him what he did. It was a simple question. It is always a simple question. Steve Harvey has asked it 10,000 times. Marcus said, "Right now, I'm in transition." Steve said, "What kind of transition?" And Marcus, who had been performing normalcy for 22 months, who had stood at the kitchen window every morning, who had the hand between his shoulder blades and the counted list of 61 people he had trained, and the memory of lights going off section by section, Marcus said, "The kind where you're 51 and everything you built your life on closes without asking you first." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" Marcus said, 22 months. Steve said, "Same place the whole time? Before it closed?" Marcus said, 22 years. Something crossed Steve Harvey's face that the cameras caught, but that is difficult to describe in language, because it was not one thing. It was the look of a man doing rapid internal arithmetic, measuring something against something else, finding the numbers don't balance the way he thought, and staying with that instead of moving past it. He said, 22 years. Not a question, just the weight of it, held in the air. He said, "What did you do there?" Marcus said he was a shift supervisor. Steve asked what that meant, practically, day to day. And Marcus, whose eyes had gone somewhere private, not sad exactly, but precise, the way eyes go when a person is retrieving something stored carefully rather than something they think about constantly, began to describe it. He described the sound of the floor at 5 a.m., the particular quality of it when all the machines were running right. He described what it felt like to walk in and know within 30 seconds whether it was going to be a good shift or a hard one. He described the 61 people. He said 61, and Dion, standing beside him, looked at his brother with an expression that said he had not known about the counting. He described a man named Theodore, who had come to him at 19, first job, first week, who had cried in the break room on a Wednesday, and who Marcus had sat with for 45 minutes until the shift started. He said Theodore had worked there for 16 years after that. He said he didn't know where Theodore was now. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey set down his mic card. He did not do this often. In fact, the show's senior producer, who has worked in television for 31 years, said afterward that, in her experience, Steve Harvey sets down his mic card when he is no longer hosting a game show. He stepped toward Marcus. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know I'm asking it for real." Marcus nodded. Steve said, "Do you know what you actually did for 22 years?" Marcus said, "I ran a floor." Steve said, "No." He paused. "You raised people. That's what you did. You sat with a 19-year-old in a break room on a Wednesday, and you made him into someone who stayed for 16 years. You did that 61 times. He stopped. That's not a job. That's a calling. And the plant closing did not close that. The studio fell completely silent. Marcus Webb was a man who had been performing normalcy for 22 months. He was a man who had stood at the kitchen window and thought about nothing in particular so that the particular thoughts would not arrive. He was a man who had been, in every way available to him, holding. He stopped holding. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds, the kind of 8 seconds that do not feel like 8 seconds, that feel like the thing inside them, which is large. He pressed his hand to his face. Paulette was beside him before anyone had seen her move. She put both hands on him, not the one hand between the shoulder blades, but both, and she held on. And Briella was on his other side with her absolute certainty now redirected entirely toward her father, fierce and wordless. And Camille and Dion closed the circle the way family closes circles, instinctively, without being asked. A camera operator near the center rig had his head bowed. 3 members of the production crew were crying. A woman in the second row of the audience had both hands pressed to her heart. The competing family, the Nguyen's from Sacramento, a warm and lively family who had come to win a game show and instead spent 12 minutes witnessing something they had not prepared for, stood at their podium in complete silence. Their team captain, a man named David who had been trading competitive glances with Marcus all episode, had his arms folded and his head down and was not trying to hide that he was moved. Steve Harvey stood in front of the Webb family and let the silence be what it was. He had stopped hosting. He was just a man standing in a room where something true had happened. Then he spoke. He turned to face the camera, and he did something that a journalist who covers the show described, in a piece published 3 days after the episode aired, as the most unguarded moment in the program's history. He said, "I have stood on this stage for years and asked people what they do and moved on to the next question." He stopped. "I don't think I've been asking the right thing." He paused. What a person does and what a person is built for, those aren't always the same question. And when the thing they do goes away, what they're built for doesn't. He looked at the camera directly. He said, "I want to talk to everyone watching at home." He said it the way he always says it, when the game has stopped. If you have lost something, a job, a role, an identity you wore for so long you forgot it wasn't your whole name. You are not less than what you were. You are exactly what you were. The plant closed. You didn't. The studio fell completely silent. Then he turned back to Marcus and he said, "I want to tell you something I mean." He said, "I have been doing this show for a long time. I have talked to a lot of people. And once in a while, somebody stands on this stage and says something that makes me go home and sit quietly and think about why I do what I do." He paused. "You just did that." Marcus Webb looked at Steve Harvey. He said, "I just came to make my daughter happy." Briella, hearing this, made a sound that was half laugh and half something that had no name. Steve Harvey smiled. He said, "I know. That's exactly why it worked." But he wasn't done. He told the producers he wanted to make a call. He said it the way he says it when the game has fully become something else. He said the show was going to connect Marcus with 3 workforce development organizations in Youngstown that specialized in mid-career transition. Not job boards, but real organizations with real people that understood what it meant to rebuild after 20-plus years in one industry. He said he was doing this not as charity, but as recognition. A man who had spent 22 years teaching other people how to work deserved someone showing up for him the same way. He looked at Dion. He said, "You too." Dion pressed his lips together and nodded once, the way men nod when they don't trust their voice. But he still wasn't done. He asked Briella, 16, absolute, radiant, what she thought her father was good at. She answered without pausing. She said, "Everything," but mostly making people feel like they can do things they didn't think they could do. She said it with the certainty she brought to everything. But this was not the certainty of someone who hasn't met her limits. This was testimony. This was a daughter reporting what she had watched her entire life. Steve Harvey looked at Marcus. He said, "That's your next job title. Whatever it is, wherever it is, that's what you bring to it." The Webb family did not win the game. They lost in the bonus round by a margin so narrow it required a second look at the scoreboard. The Nguyen's from Sacramento won, and David, their team captain, shook Marcus's hand afterward and held it long enough that it stopped being a handshake. He said, "Man, thank you for that." Marcus said he hadn't done anything. David said, "Yeah, You did. The episode aired on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, the clip had 44 million views. By the end of the week, 89 million. The single most viewed clip in the show's 45-year history, surpassing every previous record. It was covered by outlets that do not normally cover game shows. It was shared in labor union newsletters and career counseling offices, and veterans' transition programs and church bulletins. A manufacturing trade publication ran a piece about it. A professor of organizational psychology at Northwestern University used it in a lecture about identity and occupational loss, and reported that 17 students stayed after class. 3 months later, Marcus Webb accepted a position as a workforce trainer at a regional technical college in Youngstown, developing curriculum for mid-career adults transitioning out of manufacturing. The salary was less than the plant. He told the local paper he had never been better at anything in his life. The 61 people he had trained. He had, in fact, kept informal contact with many of them through the years, the way good supervisors do. 14 of them reached out after the clip aired. Theodore, who he had sat with in the break room on a Wednesday 19 years ago, called from Pittsburgh, where he now worked as a facilities manager. He said he had watched the clip 4 times. He said he wanted Marcus to know that the 45 minutes in the break room was something he had thought about for 19 years. He said he had never said so because he had not known how. Marcus said he was glad to know it now. A year after the taping, Briella was a senior applying to college. Her personal essay was about her father standing on a stage on an October afternoon, and about what it looked like when a person stopped pretending and the people who loved him moved toward him instead of away. She did not mention the game show by name. She did not need to. The admissions counselor who read it wrote one word in the margin: yes. Today, Dion works alongside his brother at the technical college. He runs the intake program for new enrollees. The first conversation, the assessment, the moment when someone who has lost their footing sits across from a person who has been where they are and came back from it. He is, by every account, exceptional at it. The hand between the shoulder blades, every morning, 22 months and counting, and then beyond the counting, into the life that came after. There is a version of a person that a job title holds: contained, defined, legible to others, legible to yourself. And then the title goes away and the version has to go somewhere, and most people do not know where to put it. What Marcus Webb found, on a game show stage in October, with his family around him and a man in a blue suit refusing to move past the real answer, was that the version of him that mattered most had never lived in the plant at all. It had lived in the break room, on a Wednesday, with a 19-year-old who needed 45 minutes and someone willing to stay. That person never got laid off. He was just waiting to be recognized. If this story sat with you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of who they are outside of what they do. And subscribe, because there are more stories here that were always worth telling.